Hello and welcome to this session all about the extent of ice cover in the UK. We're going to whiz through this quite quickly because we have a lot to get through. But welcome, my name is Lara, we haven't met before, lovely to meet you. The extent of ice cover in the UK, let's get going. So today we are going to be thinking about the extent of ice cover during the last ice age. By the end of this session, you'll be able to experience and describe how glaciers are formed and how they have changed our landscape. So this is the spec that we are looking at. As you can see at the start of the spec at the top here, we need to cover the maximum extent of ice in the UK during the last ice age. So that's what we're doing today. Let me move my face. So throughout Earth's history, there have been periods of time lasting many thousands of years when worldwide temperatures were much lower than they are today. During these ice ages, more precipitation, which is what falls from the sky, fell as snow. It didn't melt and eventually turned to ice and built up into really thick layers in our upland areas. In the last 2 million years alone, there are estimated to have been around 50 ice ages. So Britain has not always had the mild climate that it has today. Over the past 2.6 million years, it's gone through extreme cold, ice ages, and warmer interglacial periods, in a period of geological history that we call the Pleistocene. A glacial period is what we call an interval of time, or thousands of years, within an ice age. So this is marked by colder temperatures as glaciers advance and build up and get thicker. And our interglacial periods, so we have our glacial periods and our interglacial in the middle, are periods of warmer climate between these glacial periods. So your first task, please can you write a definition of glacial periods and interglacials? If you pause the video and then pick back up when you are done. Okay, second task for you. Using these two graphs that you can see here, can you count how many ice ages or glacial periods there have been in the last 450,000 years? So that is this graph on the top left-hand corner. You can see it really clearly in the last 450,000 years. How many glacial periods have there been? Okay, so today about 10% of the world is covered by ice. But that figure has been as high as 30% of the world's ice, or the world's land covered in ice in the past. One ice sheet reached as far south as London, and there were places that the ice was 3 miles thick over the UK. So as you can see here, you can see a map of the ice coverage over the UK. This ice sheet will have continued up into the Atlantic Ocean, into the North Sea, and continued the whole way up. It wasn't just over the UK, that like this picture shows you. However, this ice continued all the way up and came down to across Nottingham, around Birmingham, and almost down to London, included Cardiff in there. So you might be able to start thinking about, in the UK today, we have the Lake District up in the north of England, we have the Scottish Highlands, we have the Mourne Mountain Range in Northern Ireland, and we have Snowdon or Snowdonia that has all been influenced by this ice sheet that came down. It's called the Davincian ice sheet about 18,000 years ago. So your next task, pause this video and describe the extent of the glacial ice in Britain 18,000 years ago, which is what you can see in front of you. Make sure you use some of the names of cities that were or were not covered by the ice sheet for a really good level of detail. Okay, so what did it look like when this area was covered by ice? There's a picture here that you can see. It was purely ice. There were no animals, there were no humans, there were no plants. It was purely just glacial landscapes. Mountains that were being shaped and changed by the ice, which we're going to look at a little bit in future videos. It was freezing, it was cold, there was nothing that lived there. However, there were also areas, as you can see down towards the south of the UK and the south of the Republic of Ireland, where there was no ice, but it was still incredibly cold, and often it was covered in snow. There were no humans at this time, but animals like mammoths and bison existed, which we're more likely to see today in kind of northern Canada. So think about that kind of temperature in their winters is what we'd have experienced then. So what actually is a glacier? In basic terms, it's a slow moving river of ice. It is a mass of ice that moves very slowly downhill, that is found in cold regions and high latitudes and high altitudes. So our cold regions at the high latitudes being close to the poles, the north and the south, and our high altitudes, so high up in the mountains. So we have glaciers in the Himalayan mountains, we have glaciers in the Andes mountains running down the coast of North and South America, all because they are higher to do with the albedo effect. During the last ice age of about 10,000 years ago, a third of the world and the majority of Britain was once covered in ice. Since then, the climate has become warmer, as you might already know, resulting in the melting of the majority of glaciers. These ancient glaciers helped to form a lot of the countryside that we see around us in the UK today. So pause this video and answer this question in bold and highlight it at the top. So what is a glacier? Pause it and write it down for me. Next question, how is a glacier made? It works in stages. So to start with, snow falls and continues to fall. Over time, that snow builds up and gets compacted. And over time, as the weight of the snow that is being compacted continues to build, it squeezes, which starts to melt some of the water and press out these ice pockets, which is what you can see going down further. As these air pockets become less and less and gets filled with this water that has been compressed and squashed and squeezed over years and years and years, this then turns to firn, which then turns to glacial ice. So we have our fresh snow, our compacted snow, which is more what you see with like a snowball. Our firn is our even firmer snow. So you might have ever experienced, if you've ever been to Iceland or further up into the Arctic Circle, where the snow freezes. It feels a little bit more like that if you've ever been skiing in the Alps, for example. That's a really good way to say, actually, that is the kind of consistency of firn, but often we can't see it because it's under new layers of snow. And then about 30 metres down, we have our glacial ice. So there's very few air pockets left in our glacial ice because it's been compressed so much and leaves behind a glacier. So how does a glacier form? A little bit like what I've just said, glaciers form when snow stays in place all year and builds up over time, turning into ice. Each winter, new snow layers cover the old ones, squishing them down and causing the snow to change into small grainy pieces like sugar. After about 2 winters, the snow becomes a denser form called firn, which is between snow and ice. Eventually, the ice crystals get even bigger and the air pockets shrink, and it becomes glacial ice. However, this process can take hundreds of years. Glacial ice often looks bluish or greenish due to its density and the size of the crystals left behind. So, pause this video and answer this in highlighter for me. Using this information and the diagram to the right, please can you explain how a glacier forms? Okay, so we are now going to pick up with some glacial processes. These are what has shaped our landscape. If you have studied rivers, these will be familiar to you. Some will be new, but some will also be familiar. As we said, glaciers basically work like frozen rivers. So a glacial process, in simple terms, as the glacier gets heavier, it moves downhill. The glacier moves out of the hollow in a circular motion called rotational slip. This is what happens in a Corrie glacier. So we are going to look at a step-by-step guide of how this works. But before that, here is the spec that we are going to follow. So we're looking at freeze-thaw weathering, which you might have experienced or learned about in biology or earlier in Key Stage 3 in geography. Then we're going to think about 2 processes of erosion that are present in glaciers. So abrasion and plucking. Have a think about already what that might be. If you're plucking something, what does that do? And abrasion, you've probably heard of that in terms of rivers. It becomes a little bit more like sandpaper. And then we're going to think about movement and transportation. So our glacial processes. Glaciers move, and as they move, they do three things. Firstly, they erode or pick up material. Again, you might be thinking links to rivers. It definitely does. Number 2, they transport or carry away material, just like rivers. And thirdly, they drop or deposit material, just like a river. So, what is the difference between weathering and erosion? Erosion requires a moving force like ice or water to break rock apart or land and carry it away. Weathering is the breakdown of rocks at the Earth's surface, so we say it's in situ. It doesn't move, it happens exactly where it is. Weathering is everywhere, on roads, on buildings. If you see potholes in the winter, that is a result of weathering, and it's not a glacial process. But weathering supplies rocks and debris to help with glacial erosion. Weathering happens what we call in situ. It doesn't move, it happens where it is. Whereas erosion requires a moving force like ice or water to break rock apart and to change the landscape in one way or another. So your next task, please can you freeze this video or pause this video and answer the question above. So what is the difference between weathering and erosion? Summarise it into 15 words for me, please. Our next process. You've probably come across this before. This is freeze-thaw weathering. So your task will be to write a step-by-step guide of how this works. There is a diagram here, but we'll give you a bit more information. So when water in rocks freezes and expands, it breaks the rock apart. Freeze-thaw weathering is the main type of weathering in cold environments. During the day, when temperatures are slightly higher than 0 degrees, the snow melts and water enters the crack. When the temperature drops below 0 degrees and the water crack freezes and expands because ice is obviously more dense than water, and so it expands by about 9%. This makes the crack larger. As this process is repeated through the continual thawing or melting and then freezing, the crack gets larger and larger and larger over time. And eventually pieces of rock break off. This is important as it links to other erosional processes that we'll look at in a moment, and it is used as an agent of erosion. So your task, please can you write a step-by-step guide of how freeze-thaw weathering happens, please. Okay, our next one, processes of erosion. So when gravity causes ice to move down a mountainside, there are two ways that the glacier erodes the rock below. These are our abrasion and plucking, if you remember. So plucking is when meltwater from a glacier freezes to the base rock and lumps of cracked and broken rock. As the glacier then continues to try and move downhill, the rock is plucked from the bedrock. It's frozen to it, and as the glacier continues to try and move, it can't because it's frozen, so it pulls what it can and it plucks the rock away. On the other side of this, abrasion. You'll have been familiar with this with rivers. Abrasion happens when rocks have frozen to the base of the glacier and it scrapes the bedrock like sandpaper. Just as in rivers, abrasion works like sandpaper to create a smooth area. Plucking sticks to it and pulls, and so it ends up very jaggedy, whereas our abrasion works like sandpaper. So, as I said, glaciers erode in two different ways. Firstly, the ice freezes to the rocks as a result of meltwater and then tugs at it and pulls it out and leaves this like jaggedy material behind. That's our plucking, and then abrasion that works like sandpaper. So I would like you to draw a diagram, either one like this or slightly different, that shows what abrasion is and what plucking is. Have a think about how abrasion looks and how plucking could leave behind the landscape. So the basic definition of plucking is a type of glacial erosion that occurs when ice freezes onto a landscape, rips out rocks when it moves. As you can see in this picture on the right, you can see that ice has been frozen to this rock, and as the glacier continues to try and move downhill, it's pulled that rock away and left it all jaggedy. Abrasion is the other side. The basic definition of glacial abrasion is a type of glacial erosion that occurs when rock fragments are frozen to the bottom of the glacier. So this is our glacier, this is our bedrock, and scrape against the valley floor as it moves downhill. This works like sandpaper, often making it smoother, but it can also leave something called striations behind, where you can see the rocks that have been attached to the glacier literally scraping behind. I'll show you a photo of it in a second. So, if you haven't already started your diagram showing plucking and abrasion, so this is our abrasion photo, the lot more smooth landscape that's left behind. There are some ideas here for you. So please can you create your diagram of plucking and abrasion. This is a really helpful one. This is also a really helpful one as well. So as you can see, as the glacier is moving from the left to the right, over the top of what we call a roche-montagne, it's a landform that we'll look at a little bit later. Abrasion works like sandpaper, plucking freezes as the glacier slows down and pulls things away from it, leaving it jaggedy. And it looks like this. So you might be able to see that on this one, the glacier is moving from right to left. It's smooth to start with. The glacier has moved quickly over this like piece of rock that's on the ground. And then as it slows down, it's frozen and started to pull more rocks away, which you can see on the left-hand side here. These are our striations. This is what's left behind. So you can see the direction that the ice has flowed. So it's either flown from the bottom right up to the top left or backwards. And it is literally rocks scraping away the rocks below, leaving behind what we call striations. There are two more processes. These are movement processes. So just like how a bulldozer vehicle works, the end of the glacier pushes material ahead of the glacier due to the forces of gravity. So any pieces of sand, rock, sediment, anything that's in front of the glacier has so much power that it pushes it forward. As the glaciers then retreat, what it leaves behind is something called a moraine. We are going to look far more at moraines a little bit later in a future video, so don't worry about it too much. But the bulldozing effect of a glacier literally pushes material far down the glacier, and so we can see how far a glacier has gone and then retreated back. And then our final process is what we call rotational slip. So this is what we call a Corrie glacier. This is a small glacier up in the mountains. It's a north-facing glacier because it gets less sunlight and so it melts less quickly. And in that glacier, due to the force of gravity, if this is our back wall, our glacier basically moves like an ice cream scoop. It slips down because of the presence of meltwater and rain that falls in the back of the glacier here, or precipitation that then melts. It ends up going down, and so it works like a slip. It's called rotational slip. So it literally moves like this and goes over this rock lip that is left behind. The freeze-thaw weathering often will get sediment stuck in the back of this glacier here, which is then used as a process for abrasion, which often makes this hole much, much deeper. And this is what it looks like. So you can see at the back here, this is what we call the Bergstrom crevasse. This is the back wall of that Corrie glacier. So as the ice will have moved down, the freeze-thaw weathering sediment that's come from that has been used as a process of erosion and abrasion to deepen that hollow, and it's moved towards us. I'm not going to get you to watch this, but I will leave it in the description below. But I do hope that has been helpful. I hope it's been interesting for you to learn a little bit more about glaciation. I will see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.